I don't think I've actually ever talked about the Gatsby Charitable Foundation before, but I thought if there was any place I would do it, it would be to the Gates Scholars, because that would enhance my sense of modesty about my charitable activities. I think one of the luckiest things that ever happened in my life was that I was able to set up my charitable trust when I was quite young, and it therefore had the opportunity to work out how to do this long before it had to give away. It had large sums of money to give away. I originally set it up in 1963 when I inherited 50% of the shares of J. Sainsbury Limited, which is the family business. But it was only in 1973 that we floated the business, and then there began to be a steady flow of income into the charity. And I began to take the decisions about how I wanted the charity to operate. I think there were three kind of key decisions about that. The first was that we would only fund a limited number of projects in a limited number of areas, so that we could, in fact, in those areas, become expert and be able properly to assess the projects. I did originally try using universities and experts in universities to assess the projects. This was a complete failure because the answer always came back, I wouldn't personally do it this way, but it's quite a good project. So this never got us very far. And so we decided we would have to have a limited number of areas so we could, in fact, have our own experts. The second question was then, which were the areas that one should actually fund projects in? And I decided after a bit that the only way to do this was, in fact, to choose subjects where I was personally interested and concerned about the social issues, so that I would actually be motivated really to understand the issues, to get to know them, and to do things about them. And we picked a number of areas, and those pretty much stayed stable over the life of the foundation. They are today plant science and neuroscience. Those are two areas of science we chose, one at the right at the beginning of the trust, one towards the end, as both being extremely interesting areas of science where new technology had suddenly really opened up those areas of science, and you could see enormous amount of expansion and potential in them. Obviously, plant science, we started in the 1980s, just after genetic engineering had come in, which obviously revolutionized plant science. Science and engineering education is another field. We do a lot of work then in African development, particularly in East Africa, where most of the work is about taking agricultural crops and seeing how we can enhance the productivity in those countries. Areas which we do a lot of work in are cotton and forestry, but also in tea. A fourth area is public policy. We support two institutes. One is the Centre of Cities, which looks at the economies of cities and how you can increase the economy of cities. The second is the Institute for Government, which I set up when I came out of government. I spent 8 years in government. It gradually became clear to me that one was being asked to operate in a completely dysfunctional system. And we set up the Institute of Government to work with government to try and make the system more efficient. And the final area is the arts. That was really due to the fact my father was one of the great collectors of the 20th century. He built up this extraordinary collection. He bought, when he was a young man, three, I think, of the greatest artists of the 20th century, Giacometti, Henry Moore and Francis Bacon, when they were completely unknown people. And the deal I had with my father was, I got the shares in Sainsbury's, but if he ever wanted to build a museum for his art collection, I would pay for it, which I did. And so that was the other area for the foundation. A third decision was, in fact, to, and this probably is the most controversial, was, in fact, not just to fund projects, but in most cases to initiate those projects. We found in most of the areas there were not enough really good projects, and having got the experts in those fields, we then actually use those experts to initiate projects as well as fund them. And in Africa, we do a lot of projects which we initiate. And in fact, we find that many of the donor countries actually give us money to do those projects because they're also looking for projects. And in spite of having very considerable resources, they don't actually initiate any projects, and you are happy to fund ours. I think all this can be seen to be an example of what I think of, I call social progress philanthropy, as opposed to Victorian charity. That is to say, what we're concerned about is finding areas where we think things in society are not operating as they should, and we try and find solutions to those, rather than, I think, what Victorian charity are about, which is you find cases, individual cases of hardship, and try and ameliorate them. As a result of this, innovation is very much central to what we do. This is something I've always believed that government is rather bad at, and having been in government, it's quite clear that government is very bad at innovation. The difficulty for that is, of course, if you're a politician and there is a problem, the first thing you have to say is, I know what the solution is, and I'm already doing something about it. You can't say there's a problem, we don't really know what the solution is, and we're going to try out, experiment with some things, because you don't get re-elected, you're expected to know how to do things. So we feel that actually this is one of the things charitable trusts can do, is innovation in these areas. A final point is just to say that Gatsby was set up in 1967, so in 2017 we'll actually be 50 years old. By that time we will have given away about £1 billion, but of course the question is how much good have we done with that? I think we've done quite a lot, and that's mainly because we've been able to put together an amazing team of people from completely diverse backgrounds to actually run it and do it well. And these range from, the person who actually runs Gatsby today, his previous career was selling arms to South Latin America, so it really is quite a diverse group of people. Another person was learning Chinese in Beijing University, and that person is now running all our forestry projects in East Africa. So I think it's those people who created this, and it's been a huge fun to run. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chancellor. Does anybody have any questions?
Hi. I was just wondering, when you're talking about improving societies that aren't running the way that they should be, as you said, I was wondering if there was any thought to sort of doing so in maybe a non-traditional way, so not basing it necessarily off the Western way that we consider developed, and maybe a way that's more progressive and maybe more environmentally conscious and therefore more sustainable, if that's a thought that you took in your projects that you develop.
No, we've. I think in that context, we're kind of rather traditional. Well, actually, we're not traditional, but we have a particular viewpoint. In almost all those activities in Africa, for example, the absolute key issue for us is how do you get economic growth going, because that, above all, is what transforms those societies. You can do all sorts of other things, but if you don't get economic growth going, you don't get anywhere. And when you look at those societies, improving agricultural productivity is the absolute key starting point. And I think we, in the developed world, have been extremely remiss in not focusing on those issues, because you can get huge increases in productivity which are really transformative to people's lives. So, for example, we do a lot of work in cotton industry in Tanzania. They have a huge cotton industry. It's appalling productivity. It's about a third of what it should be. If you can transform that, and it's not too difficult to see ways to do that, then you can increase the income of about 400,000 people by 3 times. That seems to me the place to start. and people who, I mean, I think that is totally sustainable and is the way to go.
Thank you. One question that is sort of a broader question about the nature of this kind of work is that it seems as if every charity foundation is motivated by a particular vision of what the world ought to look like in the future. And I'm curious about whether in how you sort of picture the world that your work is leading to, if that's one in which there continues to be a place for charity foundations indefinitely, or whether part of the goal of foundation work is to create a world in which the kind of work you're doing now will no longer be necessary because of fundamental changes in how societies as a whole are organized.
I would hope in the future that a lot of the very basic stuff we do doesn't need to be done. I mean, and actually, I mean, quite a lot of what we do in Africa should actually be done by governments. But as they're not doing it, we think, and we can do it, we want to do it. But one would hope in due course that the world will become a place where that will happen anyway, because they will raise productivity, they will put in agricultural extension services and so on. I would like to think that happens and we reach a nice plateau of happiness across the world, and charities become a much smaller activity, which are to do with building museums and doing that sort of activity. I have a feeling somehow that things don't actually usually work out like that, and there'll be a whole set of new problems. But as a whole, I'd like to see these things just become part of what societies and economies do.
Great. Any more questions? Yes.
Thank you for joining us today. My question is about your closing comment about understanding whether you're having a positive impact and, in particular, measuring it. As Gates Scholars, we're all selected in part on the basis of our capacity for leadership. And having graduated about a decade worth of scholars, I think our impact footprint is growing. I'm curious if you think that as primarily a scholarship scheme, do we have an obligation to measure that impact? And if so, it's certainly not easy. Do you have thoughts about how we might go about measuring it and whether or not that could inform the activities that we engage in as a community?
Yeah, I mean, this is a big issue at the time. I mean, there's a big emphasis on monitoring and assessment of activities in the charitable world. As a whole, most of this, I think, is fairly misconceived. If you have very clear targets for what you're trying to do, then it usually is pretty obvious whether you've reached them and had an impact or not. So, for example, in our cotton project, we want to increase the productivity of cotton across Tanzania 3 times. It's very easy to see at the end of it whether you have or not. You do not need a great team of people to do this. Again, in the scientific projects, there are very clear metrics about scientific endeavor, and that pretty much it's incredibly easy to find those. And I think quite a lot of other areas actually, again, this is pretty unfashionable stuff. The way to do it is just to go and look and see whether it's successful or not. And as far as the Gates, your scheme is concerned, I think it will be very clear after 20 years, you will be able to say, look, these guys are in positions of importance as politicians, as lawyers, as scientists. Look at what they've done. Or it may be you look at it and say, that was a good scheme, but where are they now? I mean, some of these things are quite simple to determine.
They're all impatient.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chancellor. We really appreciate it.